Good afternoon, Year 12. So, I thought today I'd like to talk about the um, the history of women's writing, the history of women in literature, and talk you through the ideas of first and second wave feminism, which are useful concepts for your course at A level, both at A level literature and at A level literature and language. So our pre-joining material represents 5 concerns of our A-level curriculum, and 4 of them can be considered as ideas or themes, and the last one's a genre. The genre is self-explanatory. Our 2 A-level plays are tragedies. The non-play text we study on each course has tragic elements, even when ostensibly comic. Our entire curriculum in the English department at West Hatch from Year 7 to Year 13 anchors itself in tragedies. Our Year 7s have a brief whistle-stop tour of Julius Caesar, Titus Andronicus, the Merchant of Venice from Shylock's perspective, and are assessed on a scene from Hamlet. Our Year 8s study Romeo and Juliet in depth. Our GCSE text is Macbeth, and your A-level Shakespeare will be Othello. Now, that's not just because we're a morbid bunch in the department. It's more because we intend our subject to be timeless in conveying the best that's been thought and said. And what's funny actually changes generationally or even annually. If you watch the censure of relatively recent comedies in which we question whether anyone could have laughed at things so obviously reprehensible, even while knowing that we were amongst those who laughed at them. Pain, suffering, and the grief of loss, however, is universal and unchanging. Tragedy will never be subject to the whims or reinterpretation. When Priam cries at Achilles' feet, his grief is still felt 3 millennia later. So then we come to our 4 ideas: gender and femininity, or women, race, crime, punishment, or justice, and Christianity. Christianity is an intrinsic part of our national story and our national identity. 3 of the texts taught on our courses are North American. It's part of their national story and their identity too. Literature students who have watched my lecture on Chaucer will know that there's a fundamental difference between the Catholicism of England in the Middle Ages and the Protestantism of the early modern period. That enormous turmoil of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and James I, with the intercession of Bloody Mary, is a major part of who we are as a nation today. Our texts may overlap, may even be shared with the other Abrahamic religions, and our values may be shared with any religion. But when we go back any degree in our history, we find Christianity to be the dominant narrative of these isles. Of the other 3, gender, race, and crime and punishment, I did not at all expect when writing that document, the pre-joining material, to find us in a situation where those concerns were so prominent or so hotly contested. But they've always been intrinsic to our studies in the humanities, and yet we now find ourselves engaging in a worldwide discussion with more heat and light thrown upon those universal concerns. From J.K. Rowling's contention on what defines a woman, to the revulsion felt over the murder of a black father by US police officers, and the campaign to decolonise curriculum, we all begin studying the thoughts of our ancestors at a very important time. As I say, this lecture focuses on women and gender. As the only male teacher in the department, I'm probably not the first person to go to discuss feminist perspectives on or in literature, and I'd encourage you to all discuss feminist perspectives along with every other critical perspective with your other English teachers. However, lack of lived experience does not and should not preclude a respectful dialogue on any critical perspective. White Anglo-Saxon people do themselves a disservice by not engaging with post-colonialism as a school of thought. Cisgendered heterosexuals do themselves a disservice by failing to engage with queer theory. And capitalists lose their credibility when they fail to consider Marxist readings of literature. Over time, most students tend to find critical perspectives that they default to more often than others. And by year 13, your teachers can often guess which critical perspectives you'll default to in an essay, and are thus pleased and surprised when you both excel and subvert our expectations. Critical perspectives or critical theory can be considered as a set of tools. While you'll develop your favourites, some tools are simply better suited to deconstruction of some texts than others, and so it's important to have access to and usage of a full toolbox. Having completed your pre-joining material, you'll already have a feeling for some of the questions raised by feminist critical perspectives. And the movement which we tend to consider most when we consider feminist perspectives now is the rise and the key texts of second wave feminism. But I want to ground that idea in the broader historical perspectives of women's writing and writing about women. So let's begin at the very beginning. And the first text in the canon of Western literature begins like this. Wrath-sing goddess of Peleus' son Achilles, that destructive wrath which brought countless woes upon the Achaeans, and sent forth to Hades many valiant souls of heroes, and made themselves spoil for the dogs and every bird. Thus the plan of Zeus came to fulfilment, from the time when they first parted in strife, Atreus' son, king of men, and brilliant Achilles. That's the opening of Homer's Iliad. We can't really date the Iliad, but a good estimate is about 800 years BC. It's set during the Trojan War, which probably occurred around 1200 BC. It opens with a conflict between the son of Atreus, who is Agamemnon, and the warrior Achilles. And the audience are immediately given a question. Why is Achilles so angry? The conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles, who are both on the same side in the Trojan War, concerns a woman, Briseis. Briseis is a spoil of war, a woman captured from another city the Greeks had conquered. She's essentially a sex slave, and she's Achilles' slave. Agamemnon has taken her from him. This conflict between the two Greek men is a microcosm for the conflict which sets the Trojan War in motion, which is, of course, two men fighting over Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, and the face that launched 1,000 ships, if we use Marlowe's description of her. Despite the centrality of women to the plot of the Iliad, though, women never speak, never have agency. Agency is the ability to make decisions for yourself, and for those decisions to have consequence. Women are there simply to be fought over, as treasures or as objects. Indeed, many argue that the only loving adult and consensual relationship that you can see in the Iliad is actually one between two men, Achilles and Patroclus. Achilles may be sharing his bed with Briseis, but he never seems to consider her as a human. Somewhat overlooked in the Iliad, but a principal motivation in Aeschylus' Agamemnon, which you will study in your first weeks at West Hatch, is the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia. It is this blood sacrifice which allows the Greeks to pursue war against the Trojans, and it seems likely that this would be more central to Homer's narrative had Agamemnon been called on to kill his son instead of his daughter. The silence of women in the Iliad has drawn a number of recent interpretations to give voice to the women in the poem. The one I'd single out here as being particularly good is Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls, which was published last year. The most moving speech of the Iliad is that of King Priam, who comes to Achilles as Troy is losing the war and begs for the return of his son's body so he can bury him. He concludes, "Think on your own father and have compassion upon me, who am the more pitiable. For I have steeled myself, as no man yet has ever steeled himself before me, and have raised to my lips the hand of the man who slew my son." In Pat Barker's telling, Briseis watches this moment with considerable bitterness and reflects, "And I do what countless women before me have been forced to do. I spread my legs, for the man who killed my husband and my brothers. The first woman to have a voice in Western literature which isn't mediated by men is the poet Sappho, writing about 600 BC. Sappho came from the Greek island of Lesbos and was one of the 9 poets whose work was considered essential to the Greek curriculum around 300 BC. You could consider those 9 poets as making up the Greek poetry anthology. One thinks that she'd more be at home in love and relationships as a cluster rather than power and conflict. Sappho's poetry was what made Lesbos the root of our modern term lesbian. You'll still occasionally hear lesbianism being described as sapphic love. Unfortunately, very little of Sappho's poetry survives today. Only about 650 lines of the roughly 10,000 she's believed to have written. And there's only one complete poem by Sappho, an ode to Aphrodite, the goddess of love. What we have of her poetry certainly confirms that much of it concerns the love between women, although the ancient Greeks didn't consider heterosexuality and homosexuality to be the binary which we now think of it as. And if you're curious about the ancient Greek conceptions of love, the text you should probably read is the Symposium by Plato, which is an account of a dinner party conversation at the end of a city Dionysia, in which a group of significant men in Athens meets and discuss love. Given that we know that Sappho's poetry was widespread in 300 BC, there were at least 2 critical anthologies of Sappho in common usage for the fortunate few granted an education, and those anthologies would have been copied hundreds, if not thousands, of times. It's very strange that so little survives. One theory for this is that the Catholic Church in the 11th century AD objected to her morals, and indeed some Renaissance historians accused Pope Gregory of burning her work in 1073 AD because of its lesbian content. That's a possibility, but it's now more widely believed that it simply fell out of favour, and as a female poet she wasn't considered to be worth fighting to preserve in a world which was male-dominated. And so literature written by women in the Western canon almost ceases to exist entirely for around 2,000 years. And that's not hyperbole. I can only think of Lady Lumley, who translated Greek works, including those of Euripides in the mid-1500s, and Elizabeth Cary, the first woman to have written a play in 1613. There are no doubt others, but their relative obscurity in the present day rather reinforces the idea that at the dawn of the novel, literature was a man's world. The forgotten playwright of the 1600s is Aphra Behn, writing during the Restoration era, which began in 1660 and returned England to a monarchy after the previous king had been beheaded. Aphra Behn was one of the first women in England to make a successful and lucrative career out of writing. And in the tradition of her male contemporaries, both predecessors and successors, she was also a spy, a ne'er-do-well, a criminal, and a libertine. I'm fortunate to count the foremost academic on Aphra Behn amongst my close friends, Dr. Jessica Pirrie of the University of Birmingham. Aphra Behn's story and work has real interest in and of itself, but I'm more comfortable having an expert tell it, and you'll find an interview with Dr. Pirrie on my channel. I would just note that Virginia Woolf, who stated that all women writers should put flowers on the grave of Aphra Behn, is someone I'll discuss later. For our purposes, though, our tale resumes in 1792, with Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. This late 18th century book became the touchstone of what we now consider the first wave of feminism. Wollstonecraft was an author of novels, travel narratives, educational books, and political pamphlets. Indeed, it was her political attack on aristocracy contained in the pamphlet A Vindication of the Rights of Man, which gave the rights of women its name, and it is her treatise on the rights of women which granted her immortality. In it, she argued that female inferiority is not natural or innate, it's enforced by men who deny women equal access to education, and in doing this, the men perpetuate inequality and then base sexist legislation on the inequality that they've created. Furthermore, Wollstonecraft argues that suppressing the potential of half the population is irrational. It creates a society which brings suffering to all. This argument will continue to be an anchor point through the subsequent centuries of feminism. Men lose out because of the patriarchy too. Wollstonecraft wrote two novels, Mary and Maria. The latter was unfinished at the point she died, and the novels criticised the institution of marriage for its impact on women. Wollstonecraft was also a major critic of sensibility in her writings. Sensibility was and is an aesthetic trope becoming popular in the women's novels of her time, in which women are praised for their emotional nature and their romantic exceptionalism. For Wollstonecraft, these novels suggested that women's irrationality and sentimentality was innate and was a marker of their exceptionalism and fundamental difference to men. For Wollstonecraft, that idea further perpetuated the idea of inequality. Bodice-ripping tantrums and regular fainting are hardly conducive to women having the social and political engagement of men, and they make science and philosophy male-exclusive domains. Whether consciously intending to or not, women authors were perpetuating the stereotype that men were logical and women were illogical. The criticism of notions about separate gender characteristics has been echoed by much subsequent feminism, and you'll continue to see the gender debate being played out today by feminists sceptical of the idea of separate girl brains and boy brains. Jane Austen, despite her usual opting for sense rather than sensibility, would be singled out for particular criticism in Wollstonecraft's writing, and there's evidence of a mutual distaste between the two contemporaries. Jane Austen's novels concern themselves with the marriage market, in which a woman can either make a good decision in marriage or can marry unwisely. Spinsterhood is not an option, and the best of the Austen women are shrewd navigators of a patriarchal system, but they do not challenge it. Austen's books never question whether the high-stakes gamble of marriage itself is the problem. Despite her concerns about the institution of marriage, Mary Wollstonecraft married a liberal intellectual named William Godwin, who was himself a proponent of the abolition of marriage, and they had a child who he named Mary. Mary Sr. died due to an infection in childbirth. William Godwin was deeply enamoured with his deceased wife and attempted to secure her legacy. He archived her papers and he wrote a memoir of their relationship and their marriage. He believed that his memoir was an honest, loving, and compassionate account. It actually caused a scandal. He revealed that her struggles with mental health and attempted suicide, her sex with men before marriage, and that her first child was illegitimate and born to a man who fell out of love with her. Memoirs and biographies which candidly reveal the messy complexities of life are now common, but at the end of the 18th century, William Godwin's book was considered to be disgraceful and marked both him and Mary Wollstonecraft as pariahs. And the early 19th century saw female authors writing novels in which fictionalized portrayals of Wollstonecraft were used as cautionary tales of what would happen to ambitious young women who did not stay in their lane. As a teenager, Mary Jr., their daughter, eloped with Percy Bysshe Shelley. Literature students who've been diligent on the additional study already know this bit. And she wrote Frankenstein while on the sort of holiday that Aphra Behn would have approved of. She and her husband holidayed with a free love practicing literary group, including Lord Byron, at Lake Geneva. Bad weather caused them all to stay inside, and they amused each other by, among other things, writing Gothic fiction. Byron's personal doctor used the occasion to write one of the first vampire novels in English. Mary Shelley was 18 when she finished her first draft of Frankenstein, and she'd also just suffered a miscarriage, one of a number she would experience in her life. The novel plunges us into a world in which the very processes of conception and birth occur without the female presence. Frankenstein is a world without women, and Dr. Frankenstein's reaction to his own child is sometimes read as an allegory for postnatal depression. Those who know the story know that once Dr. Frankenstein gives his creature, his monster Adam, life, after adoring it in its inanimate dead state, the life causes Dr. Frankenstein to view the creature as incredibly ugly, revolting. He's disgusted by the child he's brought into the world. When published under her own name, Mary Shelley received something worse than opprobrium. She received denial. It was considered inconceivable that a woman could have written such an immoral text, and many commentators attributed Mary Shelley's masterpiece to her husband, and further argued that it was unchivalrous for her husband, who was a known atheist and reprobate, to publish his own writing and hide behind his wife for cover. Percy Bysshe Shelley certainly continued to fight for his wife's authorial independence, although in other ways he was a very poor husband. Of those Romantic era writers, the only marriage which I'd say had true contentment was that of the Brownings. The man, Robert Browning, would occasionally alternate his poetry about how a man might kill their wife or mistress with spectacular poems about how a woman might kill her husband instead. Anyone who's stayed in their apartment, and you can stay in it, in Florence, will attest that there's a healthy balance between the masculine and the feminine to be expected in a successful professional couple. At this point in history, now, we have a large number, and this is into the 19th century, we have a large number of active female writers, but they mostly seem to conform to Wollstonecraft's objection that female experience is to be considered not only physically separate to men, but psychologically separate to men also. Women writers do not have agency in these stories, outside of picking which men will marry them, and only then if they've played their cards right. One could argue that the Bronte novels offer an exception to this, but it's a slight one, brilliant though they are. It's incorrect to think that women needed to adopt a man's name to be published in the 19th century. It's a common myth, but it is a myth. In 1823, Frankenstein was issued with Mary Shelley as its named author. As I said, that created controversy. It had briefly been published anonymously before that. Anonymously. No. Sorry about that. Wuthering Heights, probably the greatest and most controversial work of the Bronte sisters, was published in 1847 under an ambiguously gendered name. The sisters used gender-neutral names under which to publish their poetry. However, in 1850 it was released in a version edited by Charlotte Bronte, who had then become a literary celebrity, which proudly proclaims that her sister was the author. Mrs. Gaskell was also writing under her own name in the 1840s. Jane Austen's work was published anonymously, but the earliest manuscripts were attributed to a lady, and they went into competition with Anne Radcliffe's Gothic romances, which named their author proudly as Mrs. Radcliffe. Indeed, at this time period, we're beginning to see something very pernicious in literature, which even back in 1813 Austen was aware of, and that's a gendering of text types. Women weren't being banned from writing novels. In fact, most novels were considered to be only of interest to girls and a perfectly suitable diversion for a lady of learning. Plays and poetry, not so much. But some women did adopt male pseudonyms to write novels. So why and what were they writing about? Well, the most prominent user of a male pseudonym in 19th century writing was George Eliot. She's the only female writer I can think of who's better known by their pseudonym than their name. Mary Ann Evans, which was George Eliot's real name, wrote in the 1860s and 1870s about industrialisation. Gone were the questions of who you had on your dance card or which household you would be a governess to. Her novels are about labour disputes, strikes, and factory conditions. At a time in which women didn't have much voice in the industrial workplace, her novels, and I particularly highlight Mill on the Floss and Middlemarch here. And if you want to go for Middlemarch, I'll give you fair warning, it's very long. Her novels, you're better off with Mill on the Floss. Her novels were entirely about the workplace and the plight of the new industrial working class. Wage slavery, debt, social idealism, and the inequalities of the working poor became the focus in George Eliot's novels. So here we see a female contemporary of Charles Dickens, with Charles Dickens' exact concerns, adopting a male name because to step outside of the domestic sphere is to step outside womanhood. The political and the industrial was still the male domain. So we see Wollstonecraft's concerns echoing through the centuries. Mary Ann Evans chose the pseudonym George Eliot in her own words to avoid being grouped with silly novels by lady novelists. We'll put our foot into the stream of superb women writers again over 40 years after George Eliot's last book. This is not to say that there were no female writers of note between the 1880s and the 1920s. In fact, there were tons of them. It's to say that the conversation changes and feminism becomes part of the dialect. The exponent of first wave feminism was Mary Wollstonecraft, but even among women's writing, you'll see very little evidence of its impact. The spark we're looking for comes in the 20th century modernists, and the figure we must begin with is Virginia Woolf, the chief florist to the grave of Aphra Behn. Virginia Woolf was the first woman I've talked about to receive a full university education. Up until 1869, women could not study, could not enter, or be assessed on any higher education course. In 1869, the University of London broke this trend by assessing female students in proficiency. The qualification that they gained was not the equivalent of a degree. A bachelor's degree, which is the first university accreditation most of you will attain, is etymologically the preserve of an unmarried man. But that certification, offered for the first class of 9 women, was the moment at which women began to break into academia and began to be considered as potentially worthy of recognition for academic accomplishment. When Virginia Woolf joined King's College London in 1897, the movement to recognise women as part of academia was in full swing. And as a member of the women's department of KCL, she came into contact with many early feminists and proponents of higher education for women. Oxford would eventually reward women degrees in 1920, when Virginia Woolf was already a published author. Virginia Woolf explored lesbianism and transgenderism in her novel Lando, a satirical and imaginary account based on the life of her fellow Bloomsbury set writer and occasional lover, Vita Sackville West, best known for her adoption of male clothing and for designing the garden of her country house Sissinghurst, which has influenced thousands of parks and gardens throughout the world. It's one of the most famous gardens in the world. It still receives about 250,000 visitors each year. In Orlando, a male nobleman, it's also the key inspiration for Central Park in New York. In Orlando, a male nobleman born during the reign of Queen Elizabeth mysteriously changes sex at 30. He then lives the next 300 years alternating between male and female lovers and lovers who conform to neither gender, and coming to terms with the perverse and bizarre power his or perhaps her femininity gives to her. In one incident, he, who's new to wearing women's clothing, accidentally flashes his ankle at a sailor, which causes the sailor to fall and almost die. It's essentially a comedy, a gentle send-up of a friend and lover, but we can also view it as an exploration of the very nature of gender and its mutability. And this idea that gender is mutable, that it's not fixed, is not a modern idea. Woolf must have been familiar with the myth of Tiresias, who was the blind Greek prophet who's both male and female, and who had been a key figure in T.S. Eliot's poem The Waste Land, published a few hundred years before. We really see Tiresias in his fore in the play Oedipus Rex, which was probably 4th or 5th century BC. Um, The Bloomsbury Group were an extraordinary set of both men and women, which contained many of the most famous novelists, economists, artists, historians, and poets of their time. They got their name from the area of London they all lived in, and a reputation for dismantling bourgeois Victorian norms and a sexual liberalism which would raise eyebrows even today. Famously, much later, Dorothy Parker described the Bloomsbury set as being a group of people who lived in squares and loved in triangles. A woman writing to reject the stuffy a woman fighting rather to reject the stuffy gender role that society had wished to force on her couldn't have found herself a better group of friends. If I was to recommend a single book of Woolf's, it would be her superb To the Lighthouse. But Virginia Woolf's real contribution to feminist discourse came in her 1929 essay, A Room of One's Own. The essay evolved out of lectures Woolf gave to the first women's colleges of Cambridge University. At this time, Oxford had no women studying at all. Obviously moved to award women degrees in 1920. Yeah, 1920. But Cambridge was the first to have women's colleges. And it argues, and women studying there, and it argues of the need for a figurative as well as a literal space within a male-dominated society and literature which allows women free expression. A woman, Woolf argues, must have money and a room of one's own to write fiction. But the essay is about more than that. When economically disempowered, women cannot create and cannot better themselves, and very few women had any economic empowerment, and so they couldn't be considered equals. Women denied access to education, denied physical space, and space within society, could never have hoped to produce their own Shakespeare. They were trapped by the duties assigned to their gender, cooking and cleaning, while men profited from their labour and were free to produce masterpieces. While occurring about 150 years before Wollstonecraft, the essay represented a key moment of first wave feminism, intersecting as it did with the very first women to be educated to the standard of men. And after the suffragists had won women, albeit on unequal terms, the right to vote. In 1918, women were allowed representation in Parliament, and in 1919, women's marriage ceased to be a barrier for a woman pursuing a career. Before that, if a woman married, they'd have to give up their career. This is the same year that the first female MP, Nancy Astor, was elected. In 1928, women were finally granted the same access to the vote as men. And yet there was still no universal access to the safe and productive spaces which affluent women were beginning to claim. Last year, Miss Hull and I attended an inter-schools public speaking competition in which a female student of a Catholic girls' school argued persuasively of the need to provide access to childcare so that women could pursue careers and be active in the workplace. She did this while informing the audience multiple times that she wasn't a feminist. When questioned as to why she would vehemently reject the label feminist while arguing a feminist viewpoint, her most coherent answer that she could come up with was that she thought feminists were humourless. There aren't a huge number of laughs at an English-speaking union event, but I'll admit that this slightly bizarre rationalisation caused a smirk from me. I suspect that what she was describing wasn't the eminently rational principles of first-wave feminists, principles which even in having an education she was benefiting from, but rather a bizarre caricature of second wave feminists. And you know the caricature already. Man-hating, bra-burning Amazons who just won't stop shouting. It is, needless to say, a complete fiction. Second wave feminism gained force in the 1960s and moved beyond the rights won by the first wave, those of voting, property owning, and basic marital independence, and an essential right to work, and pushed further against inequality, critiquing a power structure which granted women citizenship but still made them second-class citizens. The key text which began this movement was Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which was published in 1949 in French and 1953 in English. The book is part history, part literary criticism, and part manifesto. In it, de Beauvoir argues that men see women as other and view their bodies, particularly when prompted by aspects such as menstruation, to be ritually unclean. When a woman's body is seen as inherently dirty and impure, this is used as a justification for patriarchal oppression. She critiques the misogyny underpinning Freud and challenges both the reproductive slavery and the nurture trap, which the Year 10 student in the public speaking contest had suggested a mechanism to mitigate. There is, moreover, a systemic criticism of the culture in The Second Sex. Boys are conditioned to manhood, and girls are conditioned to femininity from birth. Girls from birth are taught to worship a male god, to create imaginary adult lovers, and to place the maternal instinct above all else. These aren't antiquated concerns. Today, very young boys are given toy tools and vehicles. Girls the same age are given plastic babies to look after. Preteen male toys, action figures, all depict rugged, independent men, contextualized through their work and their heroism. The equivalent female toys all have boyfriends and are excited by shopping and presents. In 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminist Mystique, which coined the term the problem that has no name. The problem was the idealized American family, complete with stay-at-home mum, and it was not at all conducive to women's health. Women with a role in the workplace, whether they did or did not have children, were less likely to show symptoms of agitation or sadness. Psychiatric drugs such as Valium were gaining the nickname Mother's Little Helpers, and in the 1960s, only the very heavily medicated could manage the idealized role of a 1950s housewife. At the same time, if you've seen Mad Men, think of Betty Draper as your example. At the same time, the second wave were interrogating sexualized and sexist economies. So, also in 1963, Gloria Steinem, who was an investigative reporter, published an account of working as a Playboy bunny and the exploitation and chauvinism which came with the job. In 1968, feminists protested to the Miss America beauty pageant under 10 key concerns, notable ones being that in almost 50 years there had never been a non-white finalist, and its celebration of feminine intellectual inoffensive mediocrity. You know the thing where they deliver a speech about what matters to them and it's always about animals and things being sad. The comparison then of the Miss America pageant to a cattle show, which was made strongly, was not lost on many. The Equal Pay Act, legalisation of abortion, and the outlawing of marital rape were all significant milestones of the second wave feminist movement. One which was campaigned for, but not achieved, was the provision of taxpayer-funded childcare. A book which my predecessor and I have awed respect for is Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch. Published in 1970, this was probably the greatest British contribution to the second wave, although Greer herself is an Australian. Greer goes further than the mainstream of second wave in placing femininity at the front and centre and continuing the legacy of placing female sexuality rather at the front and centre and continuing the legacy of de Beauvoir. It's divided into three parts: body, love, and hate. Women have not embraced the freedoms gained in first wave feminism, and now Greer says that the argument is made that those freedoms were not necessary, that women didn't want the freedom to work or to serve in Parliament. Women were not made for those freedoms, but rather, for Greer, those freedoms are actually distant and abstract concepts when compared to the sexual tyranny that women are subjected to. Only by sexual empowerment can women be empowered in all of life, and women must seize sexual empowerment for themselves. Greer presents a history of the male attitude to the vagina as something to be distrusted, feared, and eliminated. It's glossed over in female nudes. It's tastefully hidden into nothingness by millennia of artists and sculptors. The womb is a source of hysteria, ritually unclean menstruation, depression, weakness. The myth of the vagina dentata, the toothed vagina which castrates men, appears in multiple societies and folkloric traditions. It was even the subject of a relatively recent horror film. Without the inconvenience of the vagina, women are reduced to a set of curves, objects lacking agency, and sexuality is defined only through male possession. Constrained by such a framework, women and men hate each other, and indeed must hate each other. The hate is manifested in sexual violence, but more commonly in resentment and casual petty abuse directed by both sexes at the other. A staple of misogynistic and misandrous jokes plays on gross caricatures in which the other is presented as stupid, unfeeling, and profoundly irritating. Sex is presented as something won or lost, not a means for mutual pleasure. While bra burning is largely a myth, Greer's book is probably the originator of that myth, arguing that the bra, in common with other articles of female clothing, exists to perpetuate the image of the perfect curve, catering to a fantasy of the pneumatic breast, which is self-supporting, which women submit themselves to in order to be desirable goods in the buyer's market of male sexualization. The difference in attitudes towards body hair by the sexes is likewise a reflection of women's sexual subordination by men. She says this: in the popular imagination, hairiness is like furriness, an index of bestiality, and as such an indication of aggressive sexuality. Men cultivate it, just as they are encouraged to develop competitive and aggressive instincts. Women suppress it, just as they suppress all aspects of their vigour and libido. The novel which best encapsulates the second wave focus on sexuality and sexual liberation is Erica Jong's Fear of Flying in 1973, a book which seems to lean very heavily on Greer's thoughts. In Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, published in 1985, a Take Back the Night march of the 1970s is shown in documentary footage. The Take Back the Night movement was a series of coordinated women-only candlelit nighttime marches protesting violence against women, most specifically rape. While most active in the 1970s, the coordinating organisation still exists and protests sexual and domestic violence. The protagonist, the renamed Offred of The Handmaid's Tale, considers her mother's involvement in these marches to be an antiquated struggle of a movement that she has no use for. She, unlike her radical feminist mother, is happily married to a decent man and living in a post-feminist world. This is true until the Christian right take over and institute a patriarchy more oppressive than that which has been seen before. The handmaids of The Handmaid's Tale are shown in exploitative and sadomasochistic pornography and scenes from sadistic horror films in which sex is a form of fetishized violence against women. Look, the message seems to be, look at how debased and exploited women were a decade before we rescued you and protected you. While undoubtedly a feminist book, The Handmaid's Tale is cautious of the ways in which second wave feminism's arguments can be exploited. Watching the Take Back the Night footage, the Christian guardians of virtue delightedly acknowledge that second wave feminists, or unwomen as they've come to be known, did have some correct ideas. They were aware of the problem, the debasement and devaluing of women, but simply had the wrong solution. The Handmaid's Tale, in addition to a sci-fi dystopia, is a tapestry of the social and political complexity that second wave and post-feminist groups must navigate. The uneasy relationship of the oppressed and the oppressor, the Scylla of the nurture trap of the ideal housewife, and the Charybdis of exploitation, which poses as free love, but is merely the capitalistic exchange and trade in the female body. The tension between the male gaze and the invisible female. In a world in which women are barred from the written word, pen is envy, playing on Freud's penis envy. A game of Scrabble becomes as erotic and dangerous as the unclothed ankle of Virginia Woolf's Orlando. Of course, The Handmaid's Tale is one of the novels we study in depth in literature, as is Frankenstein, and so something that there'll be much more space and time to discuss in class as the year progresses. But when we do so, I'd implore you to remember that these are books which stand on the shoulders of giants, and I'd encourage you to seek their predecessors out as part of your reading journey. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you all next week.